you very much for keeping it locked right here on Spice FM, on KTN, on YouTube, and Facebook, and everywhere else, including X, Instagram, TikTok, Radio Garden, Kila Mahali. These conversations will continue, in terms of our education sector, because we have to keep asking those questions and seeking answers and seeing what the solutions would be like and where they'd come from, right?
Absolutely.
Where the solutions come from. We have to find a way of basically just getting answers to all these questions. And that's why we are continuing our conversation in the next hour. It'll still be about, schools and looking at the disaster preparedness and management in schools. We know that there is a law in place, there is quality assurance in place, there is a matter of looking at whether schools are actually well equipped to deal with disasters and what happens in terms of disasters in their schools, which is why our next conversation is going to be about, now, are schools actually prepared to handle disasters? Is there such a thing? Do we have a policy in place? Do we have it in practice in our schools? Do we have it clearly outlined and articulated that this is what happens in the event of a disaster? This is who is in charge of disaster preparedness in this institution. We've invited Njoki Mwarumba. She is the academic lead for disaster management executive program at the Strathmore University Business School. Njoki, good morning.
Good morning, good morning.
How are you?
Very well. Couldn't be better. Good to be here.
Very good. Good to have you here. Welcome to the hot seat of the Situation Room.
Asante sana.
First thing to welcome you is Citi, giving you the day's proverb. This week, the proverbs are from one country that's somewhere at the Horn of Africa.
Yes.
And what else?
It has the largest coastline. Yes.
Largest coastline in Africa.
Yes.
In the entire African continent.
But mainland. Because we have countries that are island nations. Those are a different story. Yes.
You'd have a larger one.
Yeah, definitely.
Joki, can you guess what country this is?
Somalia? Is it? No?
See, spot on.
You got it.
Excellent.
Just like that.
Excellent.
Yes.
And I like how you've distinguished that island states should not fall in the
No,
measure.
they can't. No, they don't sit for this particular exam. Yes.
Yeah.
They'll be
Those ones
cheated.
are in the different class.
They're in a different class. Yes.
I'm fast.
Now, listen to the proverb.
All right.
And then you'll give us your interpretation of it.
A mouth that doesn't belong to you cannot be shut up.
A mouth that doesn't belong to you cannot be shut up.
True.
What do you think the Somalis are saying?
Actually, it's more than just the Somalis that are saying it. It's actually a global phenomenon, and I can connect it to my field, which is disaster management, which is we have a concept of command and control, right? Where you think the approach is that you can command and control what people see, what people think, how they process information, how they respond. But we know that just like you cannot control a mouth that doesn't belong to you, then you seriously cannot control the way people think in disasters or respond. You cannot control that. And an approach to try and do that always ends up being problematic, And there's a context to that. But
Quite interesting.
Yeah.
What's the context to that?
The context to that is that historically, when you look at, from disaster science, right? When you look at how people have tried to respond and control nature, for example, or tried to control how people respond in disasters, there has always been failure. It has not worked. When we have not worked with the indigenous natural systems of life and tried to rock those systems or challenge them or force them to go a certain way, or when in the very unfortunate case, of course, where we've had the recent fires with the schools, which I know has been the topic of conversation, part of what is a dimension that really needs to be addressed is the ways in which we are trying to force command and control in a situation where a more cohesive, collaborative process needs to happen. And that can also be expounded a little further.
How does that work? I mean, so if you don't have command and control in the event of a disaster, I mean, first of all, what does command and control mean? That you have a head that is sort of like giving guidance and directions. This is how we are responding to this particular disaster. And you're saying that will not work.
Yes.
So what would work?
So what I'm saying is that will not work all the time. Okay. I'm also saying that you're right. It will work during the response phase. And that's where we have a major challenge, is that in our work with disasters, our focus is during the response phase, which is only one of essentially 4, right? There's the mitigation and preparedness, then there's the response, which gets the most attention, and that's why we're here, and then there's the recovery phase. So during recovery, then command and control is certainly, leveraged.
Yeah.
But it can only be leveraged to the degree that the recovery process that follows or the mitigation and preparedness has also been developed over time. So that, for example, when it comes to trust issues or knowing the community that you're working with, right, they already trust you and therefore can follow you, right? So as a leader, if you don't have that basis, it's going to become problematic.
It's a chain.
Let me tell you, it's
one
an
of those
ecosystem.
in that is not working, then
It's interconnected systems, and then in a weak chain or a non-existing one, attempt command and control, and it becomes very problematic.
Okay. So, I mean, let's, as difficult as it is, let's look at the nature of disasters here. And then, because you talk about command and control, and it would appear as though those two elements, in most cases, are missing. And one would also assume that command and control is only present while the disaster itself is happening and is not applied to response and recovery. So let's look at that. Mitigation and preparedness, what exactly do we mean? And of course, all of this is in reference to what we've seen in the last couple of days.
Yeah.
And even in months, what did we see with the fires that took place just here in Embakasi, or the explosion? But then let's look at the schools. Let's look at schools right now, because that's where the fire is burning, literally. So when we talk about mitigation and preparedness, what exactly does that mean?
Great question. I'm a teacher, right? So I really do have to, I really need to be sure and be concise about this. So, like I said, part of the largest problem that we have is that we really disaggregate and deal with disasters when they're in front of us on TV, on the radio, like we're doing. And then after that, this window of opportunity to discuss it, to do something about it, goes off, right? So the further you are from the proximate, event, the more you forget. So that's a given. That's what happens, very unfortunately, right? So mitigation is actually when you do the hard work. It's a process, right, of sitting down to do 2 key things, categories, right? There's the structural and the non-structural mitigation, right? So when you look at structural mitigation, you're talking, in the case of schools, for example, you're talking about the things that we are obviously seeing in the papers, right? Proximity of beds to one another, the use of burglar proofing, the locking of doors, right? The kind of flammable materials that are existent in the schools and in our homes as well. But we're talking about schools right now, right? Structurally. Structurally, we are also looking to see where are these schools located. Okay, are they in an area, for example, if it's in a forested area or in a place where access by, responding agencies is limited, what does that look like structurally? And then that also has an assumption that there's responding agencies. One thing that, really breaks my heart in this case in Endarasha is that there hasn't even been, when you read the papers, there isn't even talk about the fire brigade came. Or the that people were put on ambulances. I haven't seen that. There wasn't that expectation. But when you look at the documents in place, we have response times in rural areas in Kenya are supposed to be at 45 minutes. For example, is there a picture? Is there evidence anywhere that actually happened? So those are the structural things. Do we have a responding agency, right, that has water, has fire engines, right, has roads, access roads? Those are the structural mitigation components relevant to schools in this case.
Do they actually take place? I'm sorry to interrupt, because I need to understand if there's an understanding across board. I got to think of an architect. When an architect is putting up a design and says, okay, if we're going to achieve natural light, it needs to be here.
Yes.
If we're going to achieve cross circulation, then it needs to be in this way. When schools, for example, are being constructed, built, are these things taken into consideration? That should a disaster happen, do we have access roads? Is it in close proximity to ABC? Is that architecture taken into consideration?
Let me tell you, as a teacher, I know that on paper, that exists, right? Okay. On paper, that exists. It's there. and there's no lack of thought. And whether it's in school or just indigenous knowledge or common sense, we know to think about these things. We have it in us to think about it. The question, obviously, is always about enforcement, right? If you're not going to hold me accountable for the level of concrete I use, right, or the quality, then let's not question. Let's not question that the buildings are pancaking, right? And let's also understand that these are not natural disasters. By no means. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. We as human beings are actively involved in creating conditions where we are ending up in disasters. And then if I may finish the non-structural component of mitigation, we have to look at the non-structural components such as policies, such as laws. Kenya today does not have in law written signed a disaster risk reduction document at all. It has existed as a draft, right? And more recently, the 2017 bill remains unsigned. So how do you hold people accountable for anything? How do you build capacity?
Just tell us a little bit. What is this bill that would cover this area of discussion?
It's the National Disaster Risk Reduction Bill. And right now it's at 2017 is when it was last, tabled, right? And it actually had some strong sponsorship, but it failed to pass right before the last elections. And that is a document which at a national level would provide us, a cohesive point of reference, right? Where we can look at allocation of funding, for example. We can look at capacity building. We can look at accountability. Those parents can have at least a guiding document to go back to see, hey, wait a minute,
Were
right?
these things in place?
Yeah, were these things in place and were they enacted or not? But right now, it's a bit...
Before you go to the next, because I know you said there are 4 stages, in disaster management. So we are still at mitigation.
Oh,
You
for
said
sure.
structural, non-structural. It always baffles me because the question of, disaster management policy and disaster management laws has been discussed and it always dies in Parliament. Always. We don't have a disaster management authority. We don't have, policies in place. We don't have that law in place. And I ask myself always, why? Do you have any sense of understanding why this does not happen? Why have we not been able to enact these things?
There's a lot of complexities to it. First and foremost, I have to admit, as a professional in the field, that the document as it stands right now, really, you can see that there has been work that has gone into it, but for a current day document, 2024, it is really lacking in some very...
outdated.
Archaic.
Okay.
It is outdated in some very critical matters, right? And thankfully, there has recently been a call for public participation, and a team of people and myself that work together have submitted that once again. Hopefully, it gets some kind of review. But I think your question is as to why. Really, disaster management globally is an issue. It's very thorny, right? Because you're talking about people when they are on their worst day.
Most vulnerable.
Yeah, at their most vulnerable. And when you look at, coming back to mitigation, what really, really works in disaster management, because we cannot prevent all disasters, but we can, reduce the impact of so many of them. It's not a topic that is very popular with the politicians, because when you're talking about investing in a project that they cannot show as a shiny object within their term limited, 4 or 5 years, whatever it is, it becomes problematic. They want something that they can show very quickly. But when you're telling them to really invest in the, structural development, right? When you're telling people to invest in mitigation, which actually, if you invest in mitigation, right, the economic value of it roughly calculates to, and I'll use the dollar, is for every dollar you spend in mitigation, you save up to 13 in response, as we are right now. But that's the kind of thinking. It's almost like getting people to buy insurance, right? It's that kind of thing, right? And then there's also the concern about the funding, because we know that in the last allocation we had at least 45 billion shillings allocated to disaster risk reduction, right? And so when you follow through to see where that money is and where it has gone, a lot of it, unfortunately, has remained underutilized at the county level, which some of it could be used in, making our infrastructure, schools included, more robust. And then not only is it underutilized, as we all know, there's the money that is really seeming unaccountable. It cannot be traced, some of it. But then also you do have some counties, depending on capacity. So there's an issue of capacity that are able to really get this funding in some of the right places that it needs to be.
Okay. Mitigation. Next stage?
Next stage is preparedness. And even as I go through these stages, I need us to understand they do not exist like, in little cubicles where they're not interconnected. You're only as good as in the next stage as you were in the previous ones, right? It's an ecosystem. It's interlinked. So mitigation is the long-term strategic thinking, right? And testing and back and forth. And then the preparedness is knowing, for example, that rainy seasons are coming. We know, the science tells us what the rainy seasons are going to look like in this country, anywhere, right? And I'm just using one hazard as an example. And I say hazard, not disaster, because just because it rains doesn't mean we have to have flooding. Right? Doesn't mean we have to again expect that we're going to and lives are lost and people's cars are damaged. That doesn't have to be the case. So what happens in preparedness is that now you operationalize what it is you have been working on in your mitigation, whether it's time to dust up the documents for preparedness, whether it's time to start allocating funds and having them on standby, whether it's time to pre-stage because the rainy season is coming. Like I said, just because it rains doesn't mean it has to flood, right? Or just because we don't have rain doesn't mean we have to have a drought. The science supports that knowledge. So now it's a coming together. Again, it's not just what the government does, it's also what we do, right? There's an individual preparedness component to this as well, right? So what do I need to do about my home if there's a chance that, it could get flooded? Because we can't, all disasters are not, controllable. Like we cannot absolutely get
Give an
get
example
away
in the context of schools and school fires and school disasters. Preparedness.
Yeah.
What would that look like?
Preparedness in this case would look like this. Reading articles about, X number of schools actually have fire extinguishers, right? Yeah. Okay, who can use one?
Who knows where to pull the pin?
Yeah, who can use one? All right, so we go and check mark. We we do our drills. There's a beautiful poster over there that says, this is the meeting point.
Fire assembly point.
Fire, blows my mind. There's a bucket with sand.
At the center of the fire assembly point.
How have we taken that next step, right? To actually work with our students. And I know every student is not going to be able to pull the pin. They're expensive, those things, right? But what about if you show them exactly how to do it? Do they know where to point the extinguisher at? Do they know that? Do you know that, right? Even in your own homes, do you know that, right? Preparedness also looks like, I really would like to honor someone like Chief Kariuki, the late Chief Kariuki, right? The tweeting chief from Lanette, who knew some of the very local resources available, so that even if it wasn't a fire, he would tweet and say, hey, kuna moto kwa mama flani, there's a fire at so and so's house, tafadhali endeni na blanketi, or someone has been attacked by bees. So figuring out what you have, the resources that you have, and how you can leverage that. So whether it's the matron being aware, don't lock the doors from the outside, don't lock the doors from the outside, things like those. That is what preparedness is, or the materials, the materials that are being used in the schools, trying to have some sense of control. But it's a very complex situation.
So who should be in charge of this, of preparedness? Is it the school principal? Is it?
It's us, all of us, right? Here's why I say that. Disasters are a reflection of our society. Disasters, in this case, a fire like this one is an indictment on us as a whole, right? Because we know very well, and if we didn't know, the Bombolulus of this world, of this country, and the prior events have taught us. We know we've had committees, that have done all these reviews. So there are so many points of failure, right? That honestly, trying to allocate blame, which is understood because of the pain of this event, happens. But then there's too many of us that are culpable in this case. There's too many of us that are culpable in this case, right? It's not just whether there was a matron or not. It's not, the students themselves for whatever reason. It's not the parents for taking their students to a boarding school, because this is never a binary issue. It's not about whether we should go to boarding schools or not, right? It's a complex ecosystem approach that is possible to, if you eat it bite size,
But, talk about disasters in schools, huh? The disaster that we refer to in schools is when a building has collapsed, or it has been razed down. What has been most alarming is that those fires were caused by arsonists, and the arsonists in many of these cases, beginning with Changuli, were students. Reasons were given as to why. The question that I find interesting is, why had we not had fires before the year 2001?
Yeah.
Why did we have a period when we now started having fires? Schools had existed long before then. Before we got to the 21st century, we didn't have those fires. What happened?
Great question, because from us as a social scientist, we come back to having to look at what changed in those years you're talking about, right? We have to look at the students that we have. We have to look at the students. We have to look at the parents, right? We have to look at the country that they live in. And what is it that is causing them to think that the only option to get seen or heard or to express themselves, right? If they are as you said, they're the arsonists, right? What is it that is causing them to do that, right? And when you consider that and don't look at the students and again, just blame the students for it. They are responsible, yes, but there's a reason why this is happening. So when you dig down and to see why are they doing this, then we have a better understanding. What is it about their ecosystem that has changed? And that includes us as parents, right? Or the schools, or the larger environment. What is it about that has also changed? Because you're right. I went to school here for myself. I went to boarding school, but we couldn't even think about that. So what is that? What is that cause? So I might not have the complete answers. I have some guesses here and there, but then educated guesses.
But consider, because there are schools where the target was the library.
Okay.
Then there are schools where the target was the dormitory, where their own schoolmates were sleeping. There have been attempts at burning maybe a headmaster's house here and there. Some of them were not that successful. But the burning didn't take place because the students had a match. No. They had fuel.
Yes.
Something with which they could ignite. So
yes.
This is a boarding school. Students are only supposed to be out on weekend, regulated times. So how does a student get hold of a jerrycan full of fuel and come into the school with it?
I love the use of fuel. There are multiple fuels.
Yes.
There's more than the one physical fuel that we see in a jerrycan.
Yes.
These students are coming to school with different kinds of fuels.
Yes.
Right? These students are coming to school and experiencing different kinds of fuels as well, right? And therefore they think that this is an option. They think this is an option, okay? Where maybe there's the pressure. There's a pressure from the home to perform in a certain way. There's dissonant. There's a lot of dissonance too that they're seeing, where it could be that you're pushing them to this education. I remember, mwisho wa masomo utapata kazi nzuri sana, sio? at the end of learning and education, you're going to, but then their real experience, they can see what's happening. They exist in this society. So coming back to us trying to understand why they are doing this, we need to really look at, what do they have? What's their hope? What is it? Why are they reacting like that? Because, throwing students in jail might not necessarily serve to address the root cause.
I have a theory. Prior to that period in time, if we go back to an earlier time, educators, teachers were perhaps some of the most respected and revered people in communities. And people who taught went into teaching more as a calling than as just a career option. Then we had a period when you were selected to be a teacher when you couldn't get what it is that you had wanted to get. So there is a whole generation of people. Some wanted to teach, like myself. Others were there because they didn't have an option.
Sure.
So students taught by people who don't want to be there will be taught in a certain way.
Correct.
Give these students a full cycle where they also get to university and then become teachers using the same system.
Precisely.
The very people who are supposed to help the administration in ensuring that the school is safe and is run well may be the very people who are influencing students to not only be dissidents but to be destructive.
True. That's a possibility. That's one possibility, right? That is one possibility.
Because it is very difficult to understand how a school where people are cohesive and people get along, students coming from families, they haven't burnt their homes. There's no history of them doing anything wherever it is they come from. They come to a school. Where on earth would they get these ideas? And this isn't 20 students. The numbers we often hear are not even more than 5 or 6.
It's always about the core group, right? It's always about the core group.
But
It's
think
always
about
the
it.
core group.
Somebody plans, these people plan, think, get something that they know is inflammable. Think this entire process, step by step by step by step. Those dorms are supposed to have teachers who supervise them.
True.
They're supposed
That's
to have
a point of
prefects
failure.
yes, they have supposed to have students, prefects who are supposed to oversee these things. There's supposed to be inspections to determine what it is that you have. There are all these safety measures. And we are saying that all these things
Failed.
yes.
Failed. Yes. And then we are also adding to that we cannot start looking at this problem at the point of inflammation.
No.
We cannot.
That's
We
a
cannot.
consequence.
Because then what you're doing is you are going back to just dealing with response, right? When we need to look at them, what's going on? What's in their minds? What do they need, right? And then also the possibility that it might not, all the schools have not been burnt by students, right? So what do those investigations tell us?
Question that you would ask is, have there been attempts that were thwarted and we did not know about
Thank you. Thank you. That's in disaster management, that's called near misses.
Yes.
When we also have to study near misses, because when you look at near misses, you see what worked. But if we are not looking at those that you so well put out, if we are not looking at those near misses to understand why is it that this did not happen in such and such a place, what was that point? If we are not aggregating that data to understand what's working, then we are walking blind.
And then there are students who, by their very nature, are maladjusted. In every school, if you ask people who went to school, they know that fellow was a little off. they were not quite. They had sociopathic tendencies. They are known. They are people who are likely to do something quite bizarre. That is their leaning.
Absolutely.
And people who are trained to teach will be able to know and understand. This one requires a little more attention.
How to handle them.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yes.
you know.
So isn't that the story of society? In every society, even amongst us here, you never know. There could be this one person that is so way off, right? But what does way off mean and what does it need, right? So we are not without the knowledge or the resources to have people that can address those students. In those settings, the resources are there.
Time for a break. It's 22 minutes to 10. Joaquim Warumba is an academic lead for disaster management executive program at the Strathmore University Business School. We are talking about disasters in schools. What is it that we need to be thinking of throughout? And she's telling us, okay, there are 4 stages in disaster management, taking us through to mitigation, preparedness. You'll take us through the other 2, and looking at, particularly in the case of schools, what is it that we should be looking at and thinking about. We'll be back shortly. Keep it here.
This is the